The atmosphere in the courtroom became tense the moment Madison Carter stepped in. A heavy silence engulfed the room, as if everyone had just witnessed an unexpected explosion. All eyes turned to the 24-year-old woman, her lightly curled blonde hair cascading over her slender shoulders, her stride exuding a smug confidence as if she were walking the red carpet instead of facing justice. But what left the entire courtroom stunned wasn't Madison's arrogance. It was the shirt she was wearing. Pure white, simple, but the bold, large letters printed on it left everyone in shock. Black people. A murmur of outrage rippled through the courtroom, like a violent wave crashing against the rocks. A black security guard near the door clenched his fists, his jaw tightening with anger. A middle-aged woman in the audience covered her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. Even the white prosecutor at the opposite table shook his head slightly, looking as if he wanted to sink into the floor to avoid any association. But Madison didn't care about their reactions. Her lips curled into a smug smirk. She casually ran her fingers through her hair and shrugged, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. She liked to shock people. She enjoyed provoking. And most of all, she relished the feeling of being protected by power, a privilege she had been accustomed to her entire life. Madison had never feared consequences. She grew up in a family of influence. Her father, Robert Carter, was a former police chief, and her uncle was a federal judge. Throughout her life, she had found herself in trouble multiple times, getting arrested for drunk driving, brawling in bars, and even once being accused of assaulting a store employee for daring to ask her to wait in line. But she had never faced real repercussions. Charges always disappeared, victims were always silenced, and her father always swooped in to rescue her without punishment. This time would be no different, right? The incident had occurred 2 weeks earlier. Madison had spent a long night drinking with friends, the alcohol making her more aggressive than usual. When she entered a gas station, she encountered LaToya Freeman, a 26-year-old black woman standing in line to buy a drink. A mere glance from LaToya was enough to set Madison off, and she hurled venomous insults at her. "What are you looking at? Get your filthy ass back to the ghetto." LaToya, not one to back down, responded with a simple remark, "I think I'm looking at a piece of trash." That response sent Madison into a blind rage. Without thinking, she lunged at LaToya, punching her square in the face in the middle of the crowded store. A hard, vicious hit, enough to make LaToya stumble backward. But Madison didn't stop there. She grabbed LaToya's hair, yanking her down while continuing to throw punches, her mouth spewing racist slurs with every hit. It wasn't until store employees and several customers intervened that Madison was finally pulled away. But what she hadn't expected was for the police to actually show up and arrest her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't given special treatment. Madison still didn't believe it was a big deal. She was convinced she would get off easy, just like always. In her mind, this was nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Her father would take care of it, and she would return to her lavish parties, expensive outfits, and carefree nights. But Madison had made a grave mistake. She had underestimated the person she had crossed. LaToya Freeman was not just some nobody. She had connections, family members in government, ties to civil rights organizations, and, most importantly, no intention of letting this incident be buried like Madison's previous victims. She pressed charges. And this time, Madison was actually being taken to court. Even when forced to stand before the law, Madison refused to act with dignity. Not only did she refuse to acknowledge her wrongdoing, but she deliberately provoked the courtroom by wearing that racist statement across her chest. She thought it was a joke. She thought she could challenge the entire system and walk away unscathed. But what Madison didn't know was that the judge she was about to face was not someone who could be easily manipulated. "All rise." The command echoed through the courtroom as Judge Elijah Warren entered. He was a tall, imposing black man in his early 50s, with a face that radiated authority and sharp eyes that cut like a blade. In his 20-plus years on the bench, he had presided over murderers, con artists, and some of the most notorious criminals. But never, in all his years, had he witnessed such blatant disrespect in his own courtroom. Madison still wore her smirk as he took his seat at the bench. Judge Warren stared at her for a few seconds, not angry, not surprised, just an icy, calculated stillness in his gaze. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "I'm giving you exactly 5 seconds to explain why you thought it was appropriate to wear that shirt in my courtroom." Madison shrugged, her arrogance unwavering. "This is America, isn't it? I have the right to free speech." A deadly silence settled over the room. Judge Warren gave a small nod, inhaled deeply, then placed his hands calmly on the bench, his gaze turned even sharper. "Officer Walker." The bailiff immediately straightened. "Lock the courtroom doors." A heavy, chilling click echoed through the chamber. Madison's smirk faltered. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar, unease. Judge Warren removed his glasses and set them down carefully. His voice, though calm, carried an unshakable weight. "Miss Carter, I had originally considered giving you probation, but thanks to that shirt, I've changed my mind." Madison's breath caught in her throat. "You will not walk out of this courtroom the same way you walked in," he said, his eyes like frozen steel. "Starting today, you're going to learn what justice truly means." The courtroom was engulfed in an eerie silence. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. Everyone was frozen by the words that had just come from Judge Elijah Warren. For the first time in her life, Madison Carter felt a vague unease creeping into her chest. She tried to maintain a composed exterior, but the arrogant confidence she had walked in with had begun to waver as she met the razor-sharp gaze of the black judge across from her. Judge Warren slowly rose from his seat, placing both hands on the bench, his body leaning slightly forward like a predator cornering its prey. His voice was low but firm. "I had considered showing you leniency, Madison Carter, but you chose to insult not just me, but this entire justice system. And I do not accept that." Madison pressed her lips together but kept her defiant posture. "It's funny," she shrugged. "I didn't think a simple shirt could make you this angry. Don't we have freedom of speech, Your Honor?" Murmurs of outrage spread through the audience, but Judge Warren remained unfazed. He kept his gaze locked on Madison, his expression unreadable. "Freedom of speech does not protect you from the consequences of hateful rhetoric," he responded, his voice calm but unwavering. Madison opened her mouth to argue, but he raised a hand, signaling for her silence. He turned to the court clerk. "Clerk, read the charges." A young woman stood, her voice clear and resolute. "Defendant Madison Carter, age 24, is charged with aggravated assault against LaToya Freeman. Additionally, the defendant has prior offenses, including disorderly conduct, driving under the influence, and multiple instances of assault." Madison bit her lip. She hadn't expected her past to be dragged into the light so openly. She turned to look at her attorney, but he only lowered his head, looking as though he wanted to disappear. "And what was the initial sentencing recommendation?" Judge Warren asked. "Probation with mandatory anger management classes and community service." Scattered scoffs and bitter chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Clearly, the original sentence had been nothing more than a slap on the wrist, but Madison still didn't seem afraid. She shook her head with a smirk. "So, if you've decided to change your mind, what's the new sentence?" she asked, her tone dripping with mockery. Judge Warren's lips curled into a cold, almost imperceptible smile. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. "Madison Carter, I hereby sentence you to 6 months in the State Women's Correctional Facility." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Some people's mouths fell open, while others whispered amongst themselves, trying to process what had just happened. But the strongest reaction came from Madison. She took a step back, her eyes widening, the first traces of real panic flashing across her face. "What? You can't do that. That's excessive," she shrieked. "I absolutely can," Judge Warren replied, his gaze unyielding. "And I just did. My father will not be able to save you this time." He cut her off, his voice as sharp as a blade slicing through the last of her delusions. She spun toward her lawyer, screaming, "Do something!" Her attorney swallowed hard before speaking hesitantly. "Your Honor, I'd like to file an appeal. Denied." "But, Your Honor, this. I have made my decision. If you continue to argue, I will reconsider and extend her sentence." Madison's lawyer fell silent. Madison, on the other hand, completely lost control. "This is insane. This is illegal. You can't do this to me." she shouted, her anger exploding like a child having their favorite toy taken away. Judge Warren didn't blink. He simply turned to Officer Walker and gave a single, calm order. Take her out. Walker moved toward Madison. She thrashed against him, but the officer's strong arms easily restrained her. Get off me, she struggled. Don't touch me! But all it did was make her look like a desperate loser, flailing in a battle she had already lost the moment she decided to wear that shirt this morning. Judge Warren remained silent, watching as if he were observing someone who had just dug their own grave. Before she was dragged out of the courtroom, Madison screamed one last rage-filled threat. I won't forget this. You'll regret this. Judge Warren tilted his head slightly, his expression as calm as if he had just been threatened by an ant. No, Miss Carter, he replied. The one who will regret this is you. And with that, the courtroom doors slammed shut behind Madison, closing off a chapter of her life she had never imagined she would face. Life behind bars. Madison Carter's confidence shattered completely as the prison van's doors slammed shut behind her. The cold clang of metal echoed like a final decree. Her world outside was gone, and there was only one path left for her now, stepping into hell. The prisoner transport vehicle rumbled down the road leading to Westridge State Women's Correctional Facility, where Madison would spend the next 6 months. She sat among a group of female inmates, her wrists cuffed tightly to the metal bar in front of her. Around her were hardened women, their eyes sharp, calculating, some sizing her up like fresh prey. A woman to her left, her head shaved close and her face marred with scars, smirked. Look at our little princess in pink, she sneered. You still think you're in that pretty little world out there, sweetheart? Madison bit her lip, forcing herself not to respond. She knew that engaging with them would only make things worse, but that didn't stop the whispers from spreading around her. That's the bitch who wore that shirt in court. I saw the video. She really thought she could say whatever the fuck she wanted, huh? Let's see how the girls in Block B welcome her. Madison clenched her fists. She had once believed that her provocations were harmless, a way to assert her superiority over others. But now she was the target. After what felt like an endless ride, the towering gates of West Ridge loomed into view. Gray concrete walls stretched high, layered with thick coils of razor wire, and watchtowers stood like sentinels, overseeing the lives trapped within. Madison was yanked out of the van. The sweltering afternoon heat smacked against her skin, but what suffocated her more was the atmosphere of this place, an invisible weight of tension, a lingering presence of death in the air. Officer Walker stepped forward, looking at her with undisguised disgust. Carter, follow me. Madison was led into the inmate intake area. She was ordered to strip down completely, her designer clothes replaced with a faded orange jumpsuit, thick, rough, and reeking of industrial disinfectant. She stood naked in a small, sterile room while a female guard performed a full-body inspection, ensuring she wasn't smuggling anything in. Spread your legs. Madison clenched her teeth, squeezing her eyes shut to block out the humiliation searing through her. Next, she was taken to mugshot processing, where the first photo of her as an inmate was captured, a moment she had never imagined would happen in her life. Finally, a different guard tossed her a plastic ID card. Madison Carter, inmate number 48172. Madison swallowed hard. From this moment on, she was no one, just a number. The cell block door swung open, and Madison instantly felt every set of eyes turn toward her. Dozens of female inmates were scattered throughout the yard, some working out, some talking, others just watching. Watching her, the new arrival, but only one person truly terrified Madison, LaToya Freeman. She stood a short distance away, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. A faint scar traced from her chin to her cheekbone, and her dark, piercing eyes seemed to cut straight through Madison's soul. She didn't speak. She just looked. A cold shiver ran down Madison's spine. A tall, broad-shouldered inmate with tightly braided hair smirked as she noticed Madison freeze in place. Oh, looks like our little princess just realized who runs this place. Madison swallowed hard. She knew LaToya had influence in the prison, but she had no idea just how much. Officer Walker gave Madison a curt nod. Carter, this is your block. Keep your head down, stay out of trouble, and maybe, just maybe, You'll make it through the next 6 months. Madison clenched her fists. She still couldn't believe this was her reality now. She walked slowly toward the last bottom bunk in the corner of the cell, keeping her gaze down, avoiding eye contact. But just as she lowered herself onto the thin mattress, so stiff it felt like lying on concrete, a voice came from right beside her. "The fuck you doing in my bed?" Madison turned her head. A woman with a dragon tattoo coiling down her arm stared at her, eyes filled with cold amusement. "That's my bed." Madison opened her mouth to say something, but quickly realized this wasn't a request. It was a command. She glanced around, but there were no empty bunks left. "I don't care," Madison replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman with the dragon tattoo smirked. "Then I guess I'll teach you to care." Before Madison could react, a fist like a sledgehammer slammed into her face. Her head snapped back against the metal frame of the bed, ears ringing. Blood dripped from the corner of her mouth, but before she could even think of fighting back, she was yanked onto the floor. The punches, the kicks. They rained down on her like an unrelenting storm. No one intervened. No one cared. She tried to shield herself, but the blows came too fast, too hard. And then, suddenly, it stopped. A voice, calm, cold, final, cut through the chaos. "Enough." The woman with the dragon tattoo hesitated. The other inmates looked up. LaToya Freeman stepped forward. Slow, measured, deliberate. She stared down at Madison, eyes sharp as razors. "Welcome to prison, Carter." Madison tried to push herself up, but agony shot through her ribs. She met LaToya's gaze, her own eyes burning with hate. LaToya smiled. Just a small, knowing smile. "I'm really looking forward to these next 6 months with you." Madison Carter sat slumped against the wall, her head spinning from the beating. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, each heartbeat heavy as the pain spread through her body. She had known prison would be tough, but she had never imagined it would be this brutal. LaToya Freeman hadn't laid a hand on her, but Madison understood one thing clearly. LaToya ran this place, and that meant if LaToya wanted her to suffer, she would suffer. If LaToya wanted her gone, she would disappear. From that moment on, Madison didn't have a single second of peace inside West Ridge. Wherever she went, she felt eyes watching her. In the cafeteria, every time she picked up a tray, someone would accidentally bump into her, sending her food spilling onto the floor. In the communal showers, someone would always stand in her way, forcing her to lower her head and walk away like a defeated animal. The mind games never stopped. One night, as Madison lay on her rock-hard mattress, her back aching from the unforgiving bed, something warm and wet splattered onto her. A bag of urine. She jerked awake, the stench making her stomach turn. Laughter echoed from the dark corners of the cell, but no one said a word. She shot up, scanning the room, her fury boiling over, but everyone just pretended to be asleep. The message was clear: "You don't belong here." Madison gritted her teeth, but she was powerless to do anything. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to control her breathing. But the moment she opened them, she froze. A shadow loomed over her. A tall, muscular black woman with a shaved head stood over Madison, arms crossed, looking down at her with pure amusement. "You think this is over, Princess?" Her voice was calm, almost playful, but it sent ice through Madison's veins. Madison swallowed hard, forcing herself to mask the fear creeping into her chest. "I don't want trouble," she rasped. The woman laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that meant something was funny. "Listen up, little girl." She leaned down, her voice slow, deliberate, like she was teaching Madison a lesson. "In here, you're nothing. No one gives a damn what you want. You thought you could walk in here, wear that shirt, say all your racist bullshit, and not pay for it?" Madison stayed silent. The woman scoffed, shaking her head. "Good, because we're not done with you yet." And with that, she straightened up and walked away. But Madison knew this wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. The next day, Madison entered the prison cafeteria with her head lower than usual. She didn't want trouble. She just wanted to get through her meal without her food ending up on the floor. But the people hunting her had other plans. As she carried her tray past a crowded table, someone stuck out their foot, kicking hard against her ankle. She stumbled, and before she could regain her balance, another tray smacked into her hand, sending her entire meal crashing to the floor. Laughter erupted across the room. Madison's hands curled into fists. She couldn't take this anymore. She spun around, eyes burning with fury, locking onto the person who had tripped her, the same woman who had warned her the night before. Madison didn't think. She grabbed the spilled tray and threw it straight into the woman's face. The entire cafeteria went silent. For a second, the woman stood frozen, food dripping down her face. Then she wiped it off slowly and lunged at Madison. The first punch came too fast. Madison couldn't dodge. A fist slammed into her jaw, knocking her back. But this time, she wasn't going to just take it. With a snarl, she charged forward, throwing a punch straight into the woman's gut. But her opponent was stronger than she expected. The woman grabbed Madison's hair, yanking her down, and drove her knee into Madison's stomach. Madison collapsed, gasping for air. But she didn't stop. She lunged, grabbed onto the woman's arm, and bit down, hard. A piercing scream filled the air. The other inmates cheered. "Kick her ass! Do it!" But the fight didn't last long. A loud whistle shrieked through the cafeteria. Guards stormed in, grabbing both women and tearing them apart. Madison was forced to the ground, her arms twisted behind her back. Her face was pressed against the cold floor, her heart pounding in her ears. But as they dragged her away, she heard laughter. She lifted her head. LaToya Freeman was laughing, not mocking, not taunting. She was laughing because she was entertained. Madison shuddered, because she knew this was only the beginning. Both Madison and the other woman were thrown into solitary confinement immediately after the fight. The room was dark, cramped, with no windows. There was no bed, only a thin, pathetic excuse for a mattress, barely enough to call a place to sleep. Madison sank onto the cold floor, her breaths coming shallow and uneven. She didn't feel the pain anymore. She just felt empty. For her entire life, she had never been controlled. But now she was nothing. She had lost her power. She closed her eyes, but LaToya Freeman's smile lingered in the darkness of her mind. And she understood, when that door finally opened, the real game would begin. And this time, she wasn't sure if she could win. Madison Carter sat curled up in the corner of the solitary confinement cell, the feeling of isolation tightening around her like an invisible trap. The only sound was her ragged breathing, mingling with the erratic beating of her heart. She didn't know how long she had been there. A day, 2 days, maybe longer? Without sunlight or a clock, all she had were these 4 cold, oppressive walls. Reality and hallucination blurred together in her mind. She had never experienced this level of absolute helplessness before. Since childhood, Madison had never been controlled by anyone. As the daughter of a police chief, niece of a federal judge, she'd grown up sheltered, never facing real consequences for anything she'd done. But now, she was just another number in the system, a powerless victim, hunted and isolated. Her body began trembling, not from the cold, but from the realization that was slowly devouring her. Then suddenly, the metal door swung open. Harsh, glaring light from the hallway made Madison squint. A figure stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Ryan Bennett, her ex-boyfriend. Madison was escorted into the visitation room where Ryan Bennett was already waiting for her. He looked the same as the last time she had seen him. Messy blonde hair, sharp eyes, lean but hardened physique. But something was different. He was no longer the carefree guy who used to follow her around like a loyal puppy. Now there was a dangerous edge to him, a dark confidence, like he had stepped into a world Madison couldn't begin to understand. She pulled out the chair and sat down, arms crossed. "What the hell are you doing here?" she asked, still clinging to her arrogance, though deep down she no longer felt strong. Ryan smirked, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "I have good news for you, Madison. There's a way for you to not get killed in here." Madison raised an eyebrow. "You think I need your help?" "No, I know you do." Madison's hands clenched under the table. She didn't want Ryan to think she was weak, but the truth was, she was getting crushed. She could feel it in the way every enemy's eyes followed her, waiting for the right moment. Talk, she said, keeping her voice steady. Ryan leaned forward, locking eyes with her. The Aryan Brotherhood can protect you. Every muscle in Madison's body froze. What? She whispered. Ryan shrugged. They noticed you the moment you walked in. They know you have potential. But they don't give anything for free. If you want their protection, you have to earn it. Madison let out a hollow laugh. So what do they want? A loyalty pledge? A secret handshake? Ryan shook his head. It's not that simple, Princess. They want you to do something. Madison stared at him, a cold dread seeping into her bones. What? Ryan's voice dropped to a whisper. Take care of a rat. Madison felt her stomach twist into knots. They want me to kill someone? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Ryan shrugged. Not necessarily kill, just send a message. Her fingers tightened around each other. I'm not a murderer, Ryan. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, but you've already stepped into a murderer's world, Madison. You think you can survive in here by doing nothing and praying for mercy? You think LaToya Freeman is just going to let you exist? Madison didn't answer. Ryan studied her for a long moment before speaking again. You have two choices. You join the Aryan Brotherhood, or you keep being their prey. There is no third option. Madison's breathing grew heavy. She didn't want this, but she also knew she couldn't afford to stay weak. She lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Ryan, her expression darkening. Who? Ryan's lips curled into a smile. A rat who betrayed us. She's in Block B. All you need to do is teach her a lesson. Madison stared at the table, her mind spinning. She had never intentionally hurt anyone before. She had never gone after someone with the sole purpose of inflicting pain. But she knew, if she refused, she would be dead before her sentence was over. She took a slow, deep breath, then lifted her head. Give me the knife. She had chosen a road with no way back. That night, Madison received the blade, a sharpened piece of metal, carved from the handle of a toothbrush. She held it in her hand, feeling its weight. Not its physical weight, but the weight of her decision. She knew that once she followed through with this, she would no longer be Madison Carter. She would become a predator. She stood in the shadows of Block B, her eyes locked onto her target, a thin woman with short hair, sitting on her bunk, writing something on a scrap of paper. Madison's grip on the blade tightened. She had no choice. She took a slow, deep breath, then stepped forward. And as the cell door slammed shut behind her, Madison Carter was no longer weak. She had officially stepped into the darkness. Madison Carter tightened her grip on the makeshift prison shiv, the sharpened plastic handle of a toothbrush, her palms slick with sweat. Her heart pounded violently, like a caged animal thrashing against its bars. She had never held a weapon like this before. She had never imagined she would have to do something like this just to survive. But now, she stood in the darkened corner of Block B, her eyes locked onto her target, a small-framed woman with short hair, sitting on her bunk, hunched over, writing something on a scrap of paper. She hadn't noticed Madison yet. Ryan and the Aryan Brotherhood had given her this task, to teach the rat a lesson for betraying the gang. They didn't ask her to kill, but they wanted a message strong enough to make sure no one else ever dared to cross them. Madison knew that if she didn't do this, she would never be protected, and that meant she would never survive. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. Just one stab, one deep cut, and it would be over. But as she stepped forward, a voice echoed in her mind. You thought you could walk in here, wear that shirt, say your racist bullshit, and not pay for it? The voice of the woman who had beaten her in the cafeteria. You are nothing. Madison's fingers tightened around the handle. No, she would not be weak anymore. She lifted the blade, her body tensed. She was ready to finish this. It only took 2 steps for Madison to reach her target. But just as she raised the shiv, the woman suddenly turned around. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw Madison standing over her, weapon in hand. What the hell? Madison didn't think. She lunged. The blade sliced through the prison fabric, tearing a deep gash along the woman's arm. She screamed. instinctively staggering back, but Madison didn't stop. She slammed her forward, using her weight to pin her against the bunk. A fist connected with Madison's face, snapping her head back. The woman, panicked, clutched at her bleeding arm, her breath ragged. Madison tightened her grip on the shiv, ready to strike again. But before she could, a deafening alarm blasted through the cell block. Red lights flashed. Guards stormed in. Madison was shoved to the floor, her face slamming against the cold concrete. A rough hand twisted her wrist, yanking her arms behind her back. She didn't fight. She knew she was caught. But as the guards shouted orders, as the pain flared in her restrained arms, Madison smiled. She had done what the Aryan Brotherhood asked. She had crossed the line. She was one of them now. Dragged through the hall, Madison's hands were still stained with blood. Not hers, but her victim's. She was thrown into the prison interrogation room, where a corrections officer sat waiting. He watched her closely, his gaze sharp. "You think you're smart, Carter?" Madison said nothing. The officer smirked. "You just attacked an inmate in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses. You really think there won't be consequences?" Madison met his stare, forcing down the fear creeping into her chest. "The only rules that matter in here are prison rules, right?" She murmured, her voice laced with defiance. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Then you're going to love solitary confinement." Madison swallowed hard but kept her face blank. "How long?" The officer leaned forward, his eyes hard as steel. 30 days. Her body went still. 30 days in the hole, 1 full month of complete isolation. No one to talk to, no sunlight, nothing. She knew prisoners had lost their minds in there. She knew some had killed themselves just to escape the silence. She wanted to mock their weakness. But as the solitary cell door slammed shut behind her, as darkness swallowed everything, as her own breath became the only sound left in the world, she realized she was afraid too. For the first 3 days, Madison was fine. She spent the time thinking. She had done it. She had followed orders. She had done what the Aryan Brotherhood wanted. That meant when she walked out of here, she would be protected. But by day 5, she started to lose control. There was no sound except the one inside her own head. No light. No concept of time. And then the whispers began. They echoed in her mind, soft, steady, repeating over and over. "You don't belong here. You're going to die here. You are no longer Madison Carter." She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clenching into fists. "Shut up." But the whispers wouldn't stop. They laughed. They repeated. And then the door opened. A blinding light flooded in, burning her eyes. She squinted, barely making out the silhouette of LaToya Freeman standing in the doorway. Arms crossed, that familiar half-smirk on her face. Madison staggered to her feet, filthy, sweat matting her hair. LaToya tilted her head, eyes glinting with amusement. "So, you finally joined the game, huh, Carter?" Madison stepped closer, leaning in until her breath was warm against Madison's ear. "Get ready, Barbie, because we're not done with you yet." Madison closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had started this path, and there was no turning back now. As the solitary confinement door swung open, Madison Carter stumbled out. She had no idea how long she had been in there. 10 days? 3 weeks? Every moment in that darkness had stretched into eternity. Her body ached, her mind felt hazy, but what shook her the most was the emptiness. Solitary hadn't just taken her freedom, it had started to strip away her mental defenses, piece by piece. She had once believed she was strong, but in there was no one to prove it to, no one to provoke, no one to fight, just her and herself. And that was the scariest part. But she couldn't let that show. Not here. The moment she stepped into the hallway, she saw LaToya Freeman waiting. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed, that familiar smirk on her face. 2 other inmates flanked her, but it was clear LaToya was the one in control of this meeting. Madison halted, forcing herself to stand tall, even as her knees threatened to buckle. LaToya tilted her head, eyes gleaming with amusement. "Welcome back, Barbie." Madison didn't answer immediately. She just stared at Latoya, trying to decode what lay behind that smile. But before she could say anything, Latoya stepped closer, inches away now. You've had a whole month to think about what happened, right? Her voice was smooth, almost gentle, but there was something cold underneath it. Madison's fingers tightened into fists. I know you're waiting for me to beg for forgiveness, she rasped, her voice hoarse from weeks of silence. But that's not going to happen. Latoya let out a soft chuckle. Oh no, Carter. I don't need your apology. She leaned in, her breath brushing against Madison's ear. I just want to see how long you last before you break. A chill ran down Madison's spine. She took a deep breath, steadying her heartbeat. I'm not as easy to break as you think, Freeman. Latoya stepped back, her expression unfazed. We'll see. Then she turned and walked away, her two followers trailing behind. But just before disappearing around the corner, Latoya glanced back and winked. A warning, a reminder that their war was far from over. The war begins. After her encounter with Latoya, Madison knew one thing. She needed stronger allies. And that's when she remembered the Aryan Brotherhood. Ryan had promised her that after completing the task, the gang would protect her. But so far, there had been no sign of that promise being fulfilled. So when a secret message came from Ryan, instructing her to meet a man named Victor Kessler, the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood inside Westridge, Madison knew this was a meeting she couldn't refuse. She was led to a secluded corner of the exercise yard, where a long wooden table sat under the dim prison lights. One man sat alone. He was massive, his muscles tense even in stillness. But it was his eyes that were the most terrifying. A cold glacial blue, empty, emotionless. Victor Kessler. Madison swallowed hard and approached. Sit, Carter. She obeyed. Kessler studied her for a long moment before giving a faint, amused smirk. I heard what you did. Not bad. Madison said nothing. Kessler tilted his head, his expression unreadable. But there's a problem. Her muscles tensed. You think just because you shanked a rat, you automatically earn our protection? A cold chill spread through Madison's spine. She felt like she had just been doused in ice water. Ryan said, Ryan is not me. Kessler cut her off, his tone flat. Our rules don't work that way. Madison held her breath. Then what do you want? Kessler's lips curled slightly. Another test. Her stomach sank. What kind of test? Kessler leaned forward, resting his massive arms on the table, his icy gaze locking onto hers. Latoya Freeman. Madison's entire body went stiff. She blinked. What do you want me to do to Latoya? Kessler chuckled, slow and deliberate. We want a war. We want chaos. And you, Carter, you're gonna start it. A sharp coldness ran through Madison's veins. You want me to go after Freeman? As if this were just another casual conversation. Call it whatever you want, but if you want our protection, you have to prove you're not just some scared little girl running from the wolves. You need to be a wolf. Madison didn't answer. Kessler leaned back, his voice calm, measured. If you refuse, we won't force you, but don't expect anyone to help when Latoya tears you apart. Madison's hands clenched into fists. She was standing at a dangerous crossroads. If she went against Latoya, she would become a target for every black inmate in the prison. But if she refused Kessler, she would lose the only protection she had. She was being forced to choose a side. And no matter what she chose, the war was coming. The crossroads. Madison stood up, forcing herself to keep her composure. I need time to think. Kessler merely smirked. You have 2 days. Choose, Carter. Be the wolf or stay the sheep. She walked away from the table, her heart pounding violently in her chest. She knew there was no turning back. One decision would change her fate forever. Back in her cell, Madison sat on the edge of her bunk, her mind spinning like a noose tightening around her throat. The Aryan Brotherhood wanted her to go to war with Latoya Freeman. If she did, she would earn protection from the most powerful white gang in the prison. But in doing so, she would become target number 1 for every black inmate inside West Ridge. She could already picture it, a war with no end, where every hallway, every corner, every shadow held the potential for an ambush, where death could come at any moment. But if she refused Kessler, she knew what would happen. The Aryan Brotherhood didn't tolerate weakness. Without their protection, she would be alone again. And this time, no one would save her. Madison had never felt this trapped before. She stared blankly at the wall, her hands clasped between her knees. What the hell do I do? No way out. 2 days passed like a nightmare. Madison started noticing the looks from those around her. Not just the usual hatred or disgust, but something else. Observation. Calculation. Everyone was waiting to see what she would do. One night, as she was walking back to her cell, a black inmate suddenly blocked her path. She was tall, heavily tattooed, and built like a fighter, her sharp eyes like razor blades. "You're playing with fire, Carter." Her voice was low, cold, deadly. Madison met her gaze, refusing to flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about," but there was no humor in it. "Don't be stupid. I know what the Aryan Brotherhood wants from you." Madison's fingers curled into fists. "And if I don't do it?" The woman shrugged. "Then they'll handle you first. And if you do it, we'll bury you ourselves." Madison took a slow breath, forcing her voice to stay calm. "So what do you suggest I do?" The woman stepped closer, leaned in, and whispered into Madison's ear. "Run." Then she walked away, leaving Madison frozen in the hallway. Run? How do you run inside a prison? There was no escape, no way out. Madison realized that no matter what choice she made, she was marching toward her own destruction. That night, Madison lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about her life before all of this. The lavish parties, the designer dresses, the mornings where she woke up without a single care in the world. She had once believed she was untouchable, that consequences were for other people. But now she was nothing but an inmate. A prisoner with bruises, scars, and a fear that ate away at her every day. She was no longer Madison Carter. She had lost herself. And in that moment, she understood the most painful truth. She would never leave this place. Even if she walked free after 6 months, she would never be the same. She had stepped too deep into a world of violence, hatred, and survival, and she would never find her way back. The next morning, Madison stepped into the exercise yard. She knew this was it. Her moment of decision. If she attacked LaToya, the Aryan Brotherhood would back her. If she didn't, she would be dead. She spotted LaToya from across the yard, talking to a small group of inmates, her posture relaxed, unaware of Madison's presence. Madison could feel the blade in her pocket, the one the Aryan Brotherhood had secretly slipped to her. Everything around her blurred, her fingers clenched around the handle. One stab, one move, and everything would change. She stepped forward. LaToya turned. Her dark eyes locked onto Madison's. "What are you doing, Barbie?" Madison froze. Her hand trembled. She couldn't do it. Before she could react, LaToya stepped in close, her breath warm against Madison's ear. "I know what you're about to do." Madison's entire body went rigid. LaToya knew. A slow, amused chuckle escaped LaToya's lips. "You really think I didn't see this coming?" Her gaze dropped to Madison's pocket, where the knife was hidden. "So what now, Carter?" Madison couldn't move. She had been caught. The inmates around them were starting to notice. LaToya took a step back, her signature, half smirk spreading across her face. "You just signed your own death warrant, Barbie." Madison knew this was the end. She had failed. She hadn't done what the Aryan Brotherhood wanted. And now, neither side would spare her. She had no allies, no way out. And in a brief, fleeting second, Madison saw the truth she had spent so long avoiding. She never should have stepped into this world. But now, it was too late. Dead woman walking. Madison Carter stood frozen in the prison yard, the small blade still hidden inside her pocket, her palms drenched in sweat. LaToya Freeman met her gaze with a cold, knowing stare, as if she had seen through everything from the very start. She didn't need to say anything. Madison had made the wrong choice, and they both knew it. Around them, every inmate watched. They knew what was coming, and so did Madison. She had nowhere left to belong. She turned and walked away, forcing herself to stay calm, but she could feel their eyes on her, cold, unrelenting. As she passed the Aryan Brotherhood's group, she spotted Victor Kessler, seated at his usual spot. He stared at her, his face empty, devoid of any expression. She didn't need to ask. She knew. She had failed their test. She didn't kill LaToya. She couldn't do it. And in the Aryan Brotherhood's world, that was unforgivable. They wouldn't protect her now. No LaToya. No Aryan Brotherhood. She was alone. It all happened so fast. Madison had no one left to turn to. To every inmate, she was a traitor, someone who belonged to no one. She had become a target. In the cafeteria, no one let her sit with them. In the hallways, she heard the whispers and the mocking laughter trailing behind her. But the worst part wasn't the disgust or hatred. It was the waiting. She knew they were waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the perfect time to strike. No more choices. Madison knew this day would come. The moment she stepped into the communal showers, she realized something was wrong. It was empty. Too empty. She turned, but before she could react, the door slammed shut. And then they appeared. 5 inmates emerging from the shadows of the tiled room, their eyes cold, merciless. At the front stood the shaved-headed woman who had warned Madison before. She smiled, a cruel, wicked grin. "You really thought you could walk away from this, Carter?" Madison backed up, her hands, her heartbeat pounding like a war drum. "I don't want trouble." A scoff. "But you already caused it." The first punch came before she could move. A fist slammed into her face. Her head whipped back, smashing against the cold tile wall. Pain exploded through her skull. Then came the second punch. The third. A kick to the stomach sent her crashing to the floor, coughing, choking on the metallic taste of blood. This bitch thinks she's special. Someone spat in hatred. A hand yanked her hair, jerking her head back. Blood dripped from her forehead, splattering onto the wet floor. Madison felt it. The end was near. Then a voice cut through the violence. "That's enough." Everything stopped. Madison's swollen eyes blinked open. Standing in the doorway, LaToya Freeman. The group froze. They stepped back. LaToya walked forward, her expression calm, detached. She looked down at Madison, a broken mess on the floor, blood staining her face. "Take her out." No one argued. 2 of them grabbed Madison, dragging her up. She didn't fight. She had nothing left to fight with. Madison was thrown into a small room, the door locking behind her. She slumped against the wall, breathing hard. LaToya sat in a chair, arms crossed, watching her with mild amusement. "Do you know why I didn't let them kill you?" Madison barely managed to lift her swollen gaze. LaToya tilted her head, a mocking smirk on her lips. "Because I don't want you to die too fast." Madison swallowed, her throat dry, raw. She couldn't believe it. LaToya could have killed her. But she didn't. Because she had something else planned. LaToya stood, slowly approaching, her presence suffocating. She crouched down, leveling her gaze with Madison's. "I'm giving you a choice." Madison's fists clenched, her body shaking. "What choice?" LaToya's smile widened. "You work for me, starting now." Madison went. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. LaToya straightened, arms folded. 2 paths, Carter. 1, you do what I say. 2, so I throw you back out there and I promise you they'll tear you apart before the guards even notice. Madison forced herself to breathe. "If I agree, what do you want me to do?" LaToya's gaze darkened. "You'll find out when it's time." She walked to the door, pausing before stepping out. Her sharp eyes locked onto Madison. "Remember this, Carter? You don't have a choice." The door slammed shut. Madison sat there trembling. She had lost. She had nothing left. And now, she belonged to LaToya Freeman. The fall of Madison Carter. Madison Carter once believed she could defy the world, that she could walk into this prison and keep her arrogance intact. But reality had slapped her hard across the face. Inside these walls, power didn't come from words. It came from choices. Choices that meant survival or destruction. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she could never be controlled. Yet in the end, she had become nothing more than a pawn for those stronger than her. No freedom, no dignity, no power. Only desperation and a name that no longer held meaning. Madison's story is more than just one woman's downfall. It's a warning, a reminder that sometimes the smallest decisions can send us spiraling into darkness with no way back. Arrogance, reckless choices, the belief that consequences don't apply to us. These are the things that can destroy a person long before they even realize it. And the harshest truth of all, every action comes with a price. Will Madison ever find a way out of the pit she's created? Or is she doomed to be a puppet forever, dancing on the strings of others? Maybe the answer isn't just for her. Maybe it's for all of us. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to hit subscribe to never miss another episode. We'll continue bringing you intense, thought-provoking stories packed with lessons about life, justice, and survival. Like, share, and comment below. What do you think of Madison Carter's fate? Did she deserve this? And more importantly, if you were in her place, what would you do? Join the discussion below. See you in the next story.